Good afternoon. Welcome to this edition of Creation Justice Webinars. I'm delighted to be with all of you today as we seek to put faith into action and caring for God's creation. Today we have a terrific lineup with us, and I am joined as always by my co-host and colleague, the Reverend Michael Malcom, who is the Executive Director for Alabama Interfaith Power and Light and the People's Justice Council. Michael, I am really delighted to have this webinar today. When I think about words and phrases in the Christian vocabulary, the phrase evangelical Christianity is probably one of the most politically charged words that and phrases that can be said. And I think this is a great opportunity for us to be reflective as we think about evangelical Christianity in relationship to the climate crisis. And we have got the right people today that will help us take that reflective step back to think about what is being done currently in this field of engagement that's so critically important. And so I'd be anxious to hear from you how you are framing and thinking about our topic and our conversation for today.
Yeah, Brooks, thank you for uh, everyone who is with us. Thank you to Reverend Kyle and Emily, and thank you, Dr. Robin, for being with us. I'm excited to hear what you all have to say. Let me address the elephant in the room because I feel the need to. I helped put this panel together. In fact, I was one of the drivers for putting this panel together, and I do understand that this is an all-white panel. And I wanted to make sure that I named that in this room. And I do understand that not all evangelicals look like you. And not all evangelicals are in this discussion and voices aren't in this room. And there's no way that you can represent a community that you aren't from. Let me address that right out back. And then let me tell you why I wanted to especially put this panel together. The reason why I wanted to put this panel together is because I was reading an article, a Grist article, and that Grist article is what evangelical Christians really think about climate change. And it's by Kashmira Gander. And one of the themes that Kashmira addresses in this article is that white evangelicals often say that climate change is real, but they question whether or not human activity has anything to do with it. When I frame this in my mind with looking at environmental injustice and looking at environmental justice communities, I question whether or not there's blinders on when someone would make that type of statement, especially knowing that the same drivers that drive the climate crisis are the same drivers that affect and oppress our communities. And so I specifically wanted to have a discussion with white evangelicals concerning the policies that we have and are being implemented to ensure that we aren't leaving anyone out of the conversation, and for you all to have a call to community, a community that represents everyone. And I really believe that it's important that we start speaking with one another. And by saying we start speaking with one another, you represent a specific voice speaking to a specific group. I think it's time that you all start speaking. And we wanted to make sure that that conversation take place. And we're so grateful that you helped us and invited us into that discussion. And we can be open and hear it. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, for that framing of our conversation today. I will get right into introducing our three panelists for today. I'll introduce them in the order that they'll be speaking. First up, we have Robin Veldman, who is an interdisciplinary environmental studies scholar whose research examines how religious beliefs and cultural identity shape attitudes toward nature. She is an assistant professor of religious studies at Texas A&M University. She's an associate editor for the Journal for the Study of Religion, Nature, and Culture. And her book is entitled The Gospel of Climate Skepticism: Why Evangelical Christians Oppose Action on Climate Change. She will then be followed by Kyle Meyaard-Schaap, the vice president for the Evangelical Environmental Network. He just came to this position in the past week. Previous to that, he had been the national organizer and spokesperson for Young Evangelicals for Climate Action. He holds a religious studies degree from Calvin College, a Master of Divinity from Western Theological Seminary, and is ordained in the Christian Reformed Church in North America. And then our third panelist for today is Emily Robertson, who is a senior at Covenant College. She was profiled by Inside Climate News this past fall as she sought to get her fellow students to vote with climate change in mind. She has a major in environmental biology and a minor in writing. She is currently a climate leadership fellow for Young Evangelicals for Climate Action. We are grateful to have all three of you with us today. And Robin, if you would get us started.
How about I unmute myself? That should help. Thank you so much for that introduction. I really appreciate it. And I'm excited to be giving this presentation. I was asked to give kind of an overview of the landscape, some of the dynamics going on in the world of evangelicals and climate change, and I'm sure we'll have some more details from our other speakers, but I'll just give you a sense of what I've learned through my research. I wanted to start just with a kind of quick discussion of who evangelicals are, because as Reverend Berndt mentioned, it is definitely something that people tend to have misperceptions about. So they're about 26% of the American public, and they're known for certain theological convictions, especially an emphasis on the Bible, which is called biblicism sometimes, on a conversion experience, activism, sharing the gospel, and crucicentrism, or the emphasis on Jesus Christ's redemptive death on the cross. But one of the things that people often really get wrong when they think about evangelicals is conflating it with political conservatism. And that is, in fact, only sort of a recent part of the evangelical tradition's long history, which starts back in, if we go back to the early 1900s, this movement sort of got started with a reaction against what was called modernism within the Protestant tradition. Modernists were trying to update and adapt their tradition to be in harmony with scientific findings, and fundamentalists rejected this move. And they were known for their militant separatism and sort of reactionary attitudes. And after several decades, a number of evangelicals felt that they had, separated from worldly society for too long. And so they wanted to push for a new more openly engaged evangelical tradition. And so in 1942, they founded the National Association for Evangelicals. And that's where we get this term that we use now, evangelicalism. They originally called it neo-evangelicalism. And it wasn't until several decades later that you start to see this partisan political alignment. And that comes into the public sphere visibly in 1980 with the election of Ronald Reagan. And this is where you start to see the rise of these big Christian right organizations, as they're called. Now, the important thing to keep in mind here is that the Christian right is not equivalent to evangelicalism. Evangelicalism is this larger tradition. The Christian right is the politically conservative and activist arm, or wing of the broader evangelical tradition. So there's as some might say, an evangelical left and an evangelical center. They just don't tend to have as much visibility as the Christian right does. So, of course, we should think about why evangelicals matter to the climate debate, and I'm convinced that they matter quite a bit. We all know that they're well known for we hear about them in the news all the time because of their level of influence in the Republican Party. But one thing that people kind of don't always put together about that particular position of influence is that it means that they are also a critical constituency for climate denialists, as I'll just use that term, who also have thrown in, particularly with Republicans. So we should expect that evangelicals, whether it's environmentalists or their opponents, are kind of on the radar of people who are trying to push or delay action on climate change, because that group, making up 46% or so of the Republican electorate, their views are so critical to making sure that Republican legislatures kind of toe the line. Obviously, US climate policy, because of the leadership role in the world, has global implications as well. So American evangelicals have this really critical position in the global climate debate. And before I go on to just do a little overview of their attitudes, I wanted to say quickly, I use this term climate skepticism because—
Dr. Robin, pardon me, we can only see the first slide. Your slides aren't showing as a slideshow.
Oh, let me try. Can you see this? Oh, yes. No, you guys didn't see this?
No, we didn't see any of that.
No, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize, I couldn't see on my end that wasn't the case. I put so much time into this beautiful timeline, just so you know. Okay, well, I don't want to go over time because I know that'll take away from other people, but this is kind of the historical piece that I was trying to lay out. And then thank you so much for telling me that. It would be really hard when I get to a bunch of charts and figures if I was referring to it and you couldn't see it. Okay, so I was saying that US evangelicals have an important role in the climate debate. And then I was going on to say that I'm going to sort of do a little overview of climate change attitudes among evangelicals. And I'm going to use this term climate skepticism as a global term to refer to people who doubt that climate change is real, that it's serious, and that it's human caused. Just simpler to kind of use that one term for all of those attitudes together, even though there's some differentiation. So if you compare evangelicals to other religious traditions in America, they usually end up being the most skeptical. Here you can see they have kind of the lowest percentage accepting that climate change is caused by human activity. And it's not just one point in time where that's been the case. It's been consistently found through surveys over time, as long as they've been going. So definitely through the 2000s, evangelicals have been kind of on the lower end. So of course, the question that researchers, including myself, have asked is, why do they tend to be so skeptical about climate change? And the two answers, which I'm sure have occurred to all of you as well, are politics and theology. With politics, there's this well-known association between Republicans and climate change skepticism, and there has been a growing partisan divide on acceptance of climate change. From back in the day when there was first a public debate about climate change to now, the gap has been growing increasingly. And of course, evangelicals are known for their political conservatism. And it's important to note they're not actually as monolithically conservative as most people think they are. But however, they are quite politically conservative. About 77% of registered voters who were non-Hispanic evangelical Protestants, that was a mouthful, were Republican or leaned Republican back in 2017. So of course, that's a strong hypothesis that their political attitudes might be shaping their climate attitudes. But one thing that the research has shown is that while it is very true that politics matter, and every study consistently has shown this, it's also true that they don't fully explain what's going on. So even when you control for party identification, you still have religious variables that stand out. And one study that I think is pretty interesting in this regard found that moving from low to high religiosity more than doubles the probability of being a climate skeptic among Republicans. So we can see that there's something going on with both politics and religion. And that raises the question of what? There's been a lot of speculation. It has something to do with theology, the belief that humans have dominion over the earth, maybe that the belief that Jesus will come back soon, priority on individual salvation, or even anti-science attitudes going back to opposition to teaching Darwinism. And so that was kind of on my mind when I began my field research, which is starting to be a long time ago now, but I went and did my field research in Georgia in 2011 and 2012 among mostly white evangelicals, a subset of evangelicals I call traditionalists because they were also very politically conservative as well. And I found that they were, in fact, what could be called the good news is that they were concerned about the natural world. They believed it should be cared for, that they should be good stewards, and they actually did see this as an obligation as Christians. However, at the same time, this went along with a belief that the climate wasn't changing or that climate change wasn't serious, and a really strong sense of skepticism predominated my focus groups. And what I discovered, and what was really fascinating, was that it was in fact connected to their religious views, in particular through this sense that climate change was part of this attack on Christianity. As one of my informants told me, nowhere, and we were talking about climate change as had been in the news, and he said, nowhere in the discussion of climate change is the possibility that God might be able to maintain a consistent temperature. I think at the core of it is the denial that God is in control. So he and I heard this in all of my focus groups with evangelicals, there was this sense that climate change was almost like a conspiracy against Christianity that secularists were pushing in order to undermine Christian teachings. And this is part of a broader narrative that other researchers have found is really powerful within evangelicalism, the sense of embattlement with secular culture. So I initially thought it was kind of just this automatic, okay, well, they already thought that, and now they're applying it to climate change. But then I started analyzing Christian radio and television broadcasts, and I spent a long time going through and listening to over 300 radio broadcasts that appeared on Christian television and radio, and I discovered that they were very biased, I'll use that word, towards skepticism. And the only one that really had any level of balance was Pat Robertson's Christian Broadcasting Network, but everything else was very skeptical, mocking, and derisive towards climate change. And the evangelical mass media is not something you hear about very much. Most people, I had no idea really that it was, influential or powerful at all. But in fact, studies show that 1 in 5 Americans consumes it daily. And an older study from 2003 found that 63% of ministers use Christian radio as a source of political information, which is why communications scholar Mark Ward has labeled it a decisive, sorry, I'm moving my pictures around because they're covering my text, labeled it a decisive social institution for the evangelical movement. And so because of the evangelical mass media has ended up being, I think, a pretty powerful way of sort of convincing evangelicals that everybody thinks that climate change isn't happening, kind of spreading this idea normatively throughout the community among those who are attentive to it. So just to sum up, so don't go any longer, it's important to have some historical perspective. And I think a lot of people, when they're starting out, think that, oh, evangelicalism is just antithetical to the environment, but you don't have to go back that far in history. And even Pat Robertson in the early 90s, to find positive stuff about, to find evangelicals who are saying a lot of, things about their responsibility to care for the environment. So there's no intrinsically, it's not intrinsically antithetical to the environment. And then it's also important to look at, in terms of the future, the sort of demographic transition that's happening within evangelicalism. And I was asked in particular to talk about evangelicals of color and how they are playing into the climate debate. So religious traditions in America are pretty much all going through this transition, but evangelicalism is becoming less and less white. Even though, as I mentioned, there are around 26% of the population, only 2/3 of that group is white. And why does that matter for climate change? Well, It turns out it does seem to matter quite a bit. In a paper that some colleagues and I recently put together, we separated out white and evangelicals of color and found that evangelicals of color were much more likely to be accepting of the scientific consensus of climate change. It's also true that while evangelicalism is going through a demographic transition, there's also changes in terms of generation. So younger evangelicals seem to be more accepting of the scientific consensus on climate change. This comes from a study conducted by Benjamin Lowe, who's a grad student at the University of Florida, and I know a colleague of Kyle's. And so this is, he did a survey of Christian colleges and found that those who responded to the survey the students were much less likely to be skeptical of climate change, and they were also a bit more likely to be independents rather than politically or allied, Republicans. So there's some things changing in the evangelical tradition. And just to wrap it up, I guess the main take-home point is that evangelicalism, and as our other speakers I'm sure will speak to, is very compatible with environmental concern. That just hasn't been the predominant voice within the evangelical community. And white evangelicals seem to have really latched onto this climate skepticism. It's pretty predominant within that community. But it's also true that there is a transition going on demographically and with younger generations. So it's really kind of an open question what's going to happen. And just in conclusion, there's a lot of potential for optimism, but also it's, I think, important to be really clear about the factors that are kind of potentially, including in the evangelical mass media, standing ready to activate against that kind of activism. So thanks for your time, and I'll pass it on to the next speaker.
Thank you, Robin, and we'll transition to Kyle.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Veldman. What a tremendous primer. I'm so grateful for your insight, and I hope that our conversation and our Q&A afterwards can include lots of follow-up on your content. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about the work that we do at the Evangelical Environmental Network and Young Evangelicals for Climate Action. Specifically, why it's important to include evangelicals in this conversation, to be reaching out to evangelicals, and how we do it. So first, why evangelicals? Why are evangelicals important to this conversation? Dr. Veldman shared a lot of really helpful data and insight into that question. I want to add my own insights into why I think evangelicals are an important constituency in this conversation. And the first is simply because it is faithful, because evangelicals' own stated beliefs are consistent with actions to bring their lifestyles in line with lifestyles that are more compatible with earth care, and to address policy issues that are harming God's world and harming our neighbors. We believe it is perfectly consistent with evangelical Christian practice to be active in the climate change conversation, not least because Jesus' command to love God and love our neighbors are directly implicated in the climate crisis. Namely, our ability to love God is diminished when God's creation is diminished. We can love God better by taking care of God's creation, because God's creation glorifies God. And we can love our neighbors better by working for a future where they can flourish and thrive in a healthy environment. It is a concrete way for us to get better at following Jesus' commands. So those of us who are evangelical engage in this work with our fellow evangelicals to call them into deeper faithfulness. Evangelicals also have outsized political influence. Dr. Veldman shared this already, but evangelicals are about a quarter of the American population. Some more recent surveys are showing that population share is slipping a little bit, but what isn't slipping is their share of the voting electorate, which is remaining steady at about 25-26%. That is a huge block of people with tremendous power to influence policy in the United States. We know that the climate coalition, traditionally formed, has not achieved the policy wins that it is sought to achieve over the last 10, 20 years. The climate movement as a coalition needs to broaden. And we believe that evangelicals can play a key role in shifting the axis of power within the climate movement to start achieving those policy goals that we all share of a just transition, of rapid drawdown of greenhouse gases, of a transition to a clean energy economy. And it's important to remember we don't need all evangelicals to get there, right? If we can only capture a portion of that 25, 26% of the voting electorate, that can be transformative. And we think we can, for some of the reasons that Dr. Veldman shared about younger evangelicals' perspectives on climate change, about evangelicals of color and their commitment to action. So this is a really important constituency to reach because they have power. And because evangelicals need to do better, particularly white evangelicals. I'm really glad that Reverend Michael opened us with a reflection on the fact that so many white evangelicals continue to ignore the voices of our Black brothers and sisters, our Indigenous brothers and sisters, our brothers and sisters of color when they are telling us how the climate crisis, how pollution is killing them. And it is time for evangelicals, white evangelicals in particular, to do the work of stepping back, apologizing, and saying, I need to do better. I need to listen to my brothers and sisters in these communities, and I need to respond. We believe that that is a gospel imperative, and we are committed to calling evangelicals into that space to do better. They're also important because of the generation gap that Dr. Veldman referenced. Younger evangelicals are significantly more open, not only to the science of climate change, but the seriousness and the human element of it. This is a really strategic demographic, and it's one of the reasons that Young Evangelicals for Climate Action, which is the youth engagement ministry of the Evangelical Environmental Network, it's one of the reasons why YECA was founded, is because we recognize that acceptance is significantly higher among younger evangelicals. So there's receptivity there to the message, but they also have an enormous amount of power to influence not only institutions tomorrow when they become leaders and voters of those institutions, but enormous power to influence leaders today. An example of this are some studies from Pew that I think show this really well. This is from 2014's Religious Landscape Study. I can't wait for them to update this. I think they do it, Pew does it every 10 years, so it should be happening again soon. But already back in 2014, you see this gap becoming clear among millennial evangelicals saying that stricter environmental laws are worth the cost. I don't like that framing because it sets up a false choice between economic growth and environmental protection, and we know that that's not the case. But despite the flawed question, you still have 55% of millennial evangelicals saying, yes, it's worth it. And we know that Generation Z is even more supportive on this issue than millennials are. So I think we could expect that number now to be north of 60 or even higher of younger evangelicals saying, yes, this is important. And when you break it out along partisan lines, and again, recognizing not all evangelicals are conservative or Republican, but disproportionately, many of them are. So even when we look at younger Republicans, we see the same effect. 49% of millennial and younger in 2020 saying that reducing the effects of climate change is something the government is not doing enough on. 49% of young Republicans saying that, compared to 25% of boomer and older. So this gap is there, and it's important because younger evangelicals are the leaders of evangelical institutions tomorrow. So if we can reach young evangelicals with a message of gospel-rooted creation care and climate action, they're going to bring that heart with them into the institutions they lead in the future. And they're important because they are influential messengers today. And I'll talk about that in just a second. So that's why I think evangelicals are important to be reached on this issue. And here's how we do it. Just really briefly, a few examples. And I'll say these tactics and principles are not unique to evangelicals. These are kind of across the board best practices when it comes to effective communication. And this is coming from evidence-based research in psychology and social sciences. But every community has their own distinct flavor and way that they implement these principles to reach their community. So here's how we are trying to reach evangelicals, and how I think more of us, even those of us who don't identify as evangelicals, can be more sensitive to messaging that's more effective with our community. So the first principle is building on shared values, recognizing and affirming existing identities, communicating via trusted messengers, and rooting action in hope. I'm going to take each of these in turn really briefly. So first, building on shared values. We try to communicate in all of our work how climate action is connected to existing evangelical values. In other words, saying the things you already care about are impacted by the climate crisis, and acting to address it deepens your commitment to these values. A couple of examples. Dr. Veldman shared, evangelicals are very proud of the fact that they hold the Bible in high esteem, that the Bible is the only rule of life and faith for evangelicals. So we take evangelicals to scripture. We say, you take the Bible seriously? Terrific. So do we. Let's get serious about what the Bible has to say, about what God thinks of God's creation, about our call to care for it, about our responsibility to our neighbors. And we go from Genesis to Revelation and right through the heart of Genesis, not just right through the heart of the gospel. We don't just sit in Genesis. And we walk them through the fullness of Scripture's witness to our call to respond to creation's groaning. The sanctity of life. Everyone knows evangelicals are famous for their opposition to abortion and the underlying value of defending the sanctity of life. What they're less famous for is things like the National Association of Evangelicals articulating a holistic ethic of life, which understands euthanasia and the death penalty and poverty and creation care and others as life issues too. So we work to integrate creation care and climate change into the existing value of protecting and defending life, and help evangelicals understand how climate change is a threat to life on Earth. Not only creatures, but very much human beings as well, the neighbors we're called to love. And finally, evangelicals have a passion for evangelism. So we help evangelicals understand climate action as part of making our evangelism more effective, of communicating the good news of Jesus for the entire world by making sure that the way we live in the world is good news for the very people Jesus said it's for the poor, for the oppressed, the marginalized, those in prison. That is who we are called to proclaim the good news of Jesus to. And if the way we live in the world isn't good news for those people, then our evangelism is blunted. Second, we work to recognize and affirm existing identities in our community. Dr. Catherine Hayhoe is a renowned climate scientist and an evangelical Christian, and she likes to say, everybody already has everything they need to care about climate change. In other words, no one has to become someone different to do something about climate change. They just have to recognize that who they are already cares about it. This is how many people in our community hear messages from the mainstream climate movement. And this is not meant as a judgment. I understand the climate movement does not mean to communicate this to evangelicals or others who are outside of the mainstream movement. However, this is how many people hear it. Here are all the reasons that you and your loved ones are wrong. Here are all the reasons we and others who are nothing like you are right. Here are all the ways that you need to radically change the life that you love if you want to be right, like us. Doing so will alienate you from every person you know and love, but don't worry, because it'll make you more like us and the world will be more like we want it to be. Compelling stuff. And again, I'm not saying that this is intentional, but we know that intent does not equal impact, right? Whether the climate movement means to communicate this to people outside the mainstream movement or not, the impact is that many people hear this. You need to sacrifice, change who you are to become more like us because we're right and you're wrong. So we work really hard to try to communicate in ways that they can hear this. Here are all the things that you care about and that make your community great, right? We start right there by affirming who they are and the values that they hold dear. Here are all the people just like you, your peers at church and in school, other evangelical Christians who care about the things that you care about, who are taking action to address climate change. When you join them, you deepen your connections to these people, and the world becomes more like you want it to be. Communicating via trusted messengers. We all know that in many cases, the messenger is more important than the message, especially in really polarized topics like climate change. So we work really hard to cultivate messengers that our community will find trustworthy and listen to. And first among them is their own peers. We have programs to train and equip church members to educate and equip their own peers in their church through small groups, studies, so that they're not hearing from someone coming in from the outside, but they're hearing from Jim, their elder, who they've sat next to for 20 years at church, who they trust. Their kids. We talked already about how young evangelicals are a uniquely equipped messengers to meet their parents. We have a campaign where dozens and dozens of young evangelicals are recording and posting their climate testimonies so that people can see what young Christians are saying about why this is important to them. A recent study that was published in Nature, I think, makes this clear. It showed how kids and young people have an impact on their parents' understanding of climate change and their concern around climate change. And they found that the most statistically significant relationship is daughters of conservative fathers. Daughters of conservative fathers have the most impact in changing their parents' minds when it comes to climate change. Kids, daughters, can reach conservative fathers in ways that climate activists, Al Gore, others cannot. So we need to equip them to do that well. And finally, their leaders, pastors, other trusted voices like authors, musicians, people with a platform in the evangelical space. And finally, this is my last slide. We root everything we do in hope because we recognize that fear can often be a catalyst for people to engage in this conversation, but it will not sustain action. So we root everything we do in hope. The hope of meaningful personal practices. We equip people to make changes in their own lifestyles, not just because it makes an impact on the climate crisis, but also because as Christians, we believe that the things we do with our bodies, the way we live and move and have our being in the world, shapes us. These are spiritual practices. They form our hearts after God's heart, which scripture is clear is a heart for God's creation. The hope of collective action. We call people to Washington, D.C., up to Capitol Hill. We call them into the streets and we march and we practice collective action together so that evangelicals can catch the vision for what that looks like and be inspired for future action. And finally, the hope of God's good future for the world. We believe at EEN that Christ is reconciling everything back to God's self and somehow has the entire creation in God's saving sights. And that means that all of it matters. And if all of it matters, then it matters how we live in relationship to it right now. So we call evangelicals to live now as if they believe that coming good future is true. So that was really quick. I know I didn't have a lot of time. Love to engage more in the Q&A. This is my contact info. Would love to be in touch. Thanks.
Terrific, Kyle. Thank you so much. And now we'll turn to our final speaker, Emily.
Great, thank you. All right. I think it might take a second for me to pull up my screen. Sorry about that.
No problem. As you do that, I'll just remind people that if you have a question for any of our panelists, go ahead and feel free to type that in the Q&A box. You can access that through the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen.
Okay, here we go. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about how, as an evangelical, the climate crisis is very much like something we should care about. So I am a Gen Zer. I like to call myself a zillennial though, because I feel like I vibe well with millennials as well. So I'm kind of in between. But so that being said, I honestly am only just now learning about like what it means to really be an evangelical. So I like did some research with the help of a friend, and Kyle actually touched on a couple of these, but I just wanted to address like the specifics, the specific convictions that evangelicals share. Those being a shared authority, a shared experience, a shared mission, and a shared vision, all of these being centered around the cross. So I'm just going to be going through like exactly like those specific points. So our shared authority is the Bible. Robin and Kyle already kind of addressed these things, but I wanted to dive in a little deeper. So of course, like being an evangelical, I believe that scripture is the ultimate word. It is a source of life, and it's something I aim to study every day because that's just what I believe in doing as an evangelical. And I look to scripture for help and understanding of how to live my life. That being said, reading scripture has helped me realize my calling toward creation care. Genesis 2:15 says, "The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work and keep it." So obviously this was in an idealized earth setting before the fall, but that doesn't mean that today we aren't responsible for being stewards of creation. So that's, I think, the Bible definitely makes that clear that we are to be stewards and caretakers of the earth. And then in the New Testament, Jesus himself uses nature as imagery in his parables. He talks about birds and seeds and plants, and he uses those in a way where I think it emphasizes the importance of nature. I mean, the creation story, whether you're an old earth creationist or newer or young earth, we all believe it as evangelicals. And like the fact that God even made the earth and he made so much, like shows his creativity and his love for us, because we get to see nature, we get to experience it, and that is beautiful. And the Bible being the inerrant word, like that's something that we put highly above ourselves and should be following. So our shared experience, however, is considered conversion. So us coming to Christ, coming to know him. And evangelicals, their goal ultimately is to help bring people to Christ, of course, as well as trying to follow Christ as best as we can. But I do not believe that we can bring people to Christ without advocating for people and the problems they experience. So the climate crisis being a big one, so many people, how do we expect them to come to Christ if we are, as evangelicals, say we're just talking to someone about our faith, and they bring up how maybe environmental conditions or pollution has impacted them or their family. If an evangelical is in that position and they're a climate denier, what are they going to say to that? Are they just going to totally discount that person experiences problems because of climate change? So I think that caring about the climate crisis is pivotal in our work as evangelicals trying to bring others to Christ. So truly, environmental justice fits right into that experience of conversion. Evangelization, I mean, that goes pretty well with conversion. It's really just the the process of trying to convert people to Christianity. But evangelizing just means to spread the gospel message. And that is the good news, that we have hope. We have the hope of Christ because he died for our sins. And as an evangelical, personally, I think that I've been given a calling to care about the earth. And because of that, I want to be a light in other people's lives by living out that calling and showing others that because I care about my faith, that means I care about the earth. That means I care about everyone being impacted by climate change. That means I care about everyone experiencing social injustices of any form, including environmental injustices. So I definitely believe that caring for the earth is a way we can follow Jesus's teachings, to be more like him and love him better and love our neighbors better. Because, if your neighbor, that includes someone across the seas who lives in a small village where the sea levels might be rising, and that's threatening their food source or causing them to relocate. Climate refugees are a real thing, and it's pivotal that we care about those people. And I think that spreading the gospel, it certainly includes understanding the problems in the world that are a result of sin and the fall and just humans not taking action. And it's disappointing that a lot of evangelicals don't seem to care about climate change when it clearly is an issue. The science is very clear about that. And it's also clear that we play a role in creation care and stewarding the earth. Finally, shared vision is spiritual renewal. So that pretty much spiritual renewal can happen within church as well as society, whether it be serving God, serving others, or following in the footsteps of Christ. For me, I feel spiritually renewed when I am obeying God and his commands that I am a steward and caretaker of the earth. So, and because he created the earth and everything that's in it, I think that gives us purpose, and as well as serving others. I find a lot of joy in volunteering and trying to help others. And because of that, I am able to feel the Holy Spirit moving in me when I am following my passions for the environment. So for sure, working toward better environmental conditions and lessening pollution and fossil fuel production. There's so much work that needs to be done, especially at the government level. But those are all great ways to renew one's spirit and inspire others to do so as well. So finally, kind of just to wrap up my points, the climate crisis is a human rights issue. It is a justice issue all the way. And as evangelicals, there tends to be certain issues that evangelicals are more respondent towards, such as abortion and wanting to advance, pro-life legislations. But truly, the climate crisis is also a pro-life issue, which I think more people need to understand. It's certainly evangelical calling to care about all people, and that includes those who are being impacted by the environment. It's unfortunate that a lot of times the people who contribute most to climate change are those who experience the impacts less. And I think that's something we all need to continually think about. Because for me, obviously I care about climate change a lot. And I have to remind myself, even if it makes me really sad to think through things or watch documentaries, but I have to remind myself of why I'm fighting. And it can be exhausting. Like, I'm a senior in college and I've been writing my senior thesis about environmental racism. And I'm already exhausted, but I also know that I have passion for this. And as an evangelical, I know this is what I want to keep fighting against. I want to fight against environmental racism and environmental justices in all categories. Just as Jesus cared for the least of these, we are to do so as well. And that means caring for everyone, especially people of color that are being most impacted by the climate crisis. These inequities certainly exist, and it's very disappointing. But there is hope, and I'm very thankful to be part of a few communities of evangelicals that do care about climate change. And I'm very thankful to be part of this webinar because it's just such a good way to educate others on this topic and to hopefully enlighten people a little bit. But that is all I have. So I'm very thankful and I'm open to any questions. My email is just emily.robertson@covenant.edu. You can probably find that online somewhere. Sorry I didn't add my contact info, but yeah, reach out to me if you would like.
Thank you, Emily. Perhaps you can put it in the chat if you'd like, and that way you can get it out as well. So I've got a question, and I know there are other questions that we have. Hopefully we'll have time to get to them, but we're running close, so I don't know. Dr. Robin, in your statistics, I appreciated seeing that the demographics for evangelicals, both what we talked about or what I reflected on earlier, and that the umbrella is widening. However, I'm cautiously optimistic at the change at the institutional level because when I look recently, there's just been a scandal or a skirmish concerning race theory and the rejection of it from one of the largest denominations within the evangelical movement, and one of the largest, not one of the largest Protestant denomination in the United States, have denied race as an issue. But we know that environmental injustices happen, particularly to Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. How likely are we to get people who are evangelicals to be on board with the climate crisis or changing the climate crisis if they continue to ignore the people that are actually ill affected right now by it?
That's a really good question, and I some of the other speakers might even have more of a read on that. I think one thing I can say, and I do know from my research in the media, evangelical mass media is 100% white owned, and so it ends up reflecting the interests of that particular cultural group. So that's not the only institution, obviously, within evangelicalism, as you're referring to I believe the Southern Baptist Convention, probably, they've got their own institutions and they're making efforts or, having kind of a battle over how to be more inclusive. But at least for the media sphere, I think there's really no competition. There's not even an attempt to diversify those voices. So the grassroots activism, I think, exists and is powerful, but it's slow. And there's we have that intersection of we need to do something now. And these changes are coming slowly. So that's the challenge. I think recognizing the challenge is at least the first step, though.
Reverend Kyle, I'd love to hear your take on that.
Yeah, thanks. I think one of the first things we need to do is acknowledge that racism is embedded in the foundations of the American church from the very beginning. Read The Color of Compromise by Jemar Tisby, any number of historical accounts of how the U.S. church as an institution and a social expression and racism and chattel slavery as an institution developed at the same time, and reinforced each other. And we've never had an honest conversation about that reality in the U.S. And I don't think we're going to make progress until we actually do. I can say I think white Christians have a particular responsibility to lead other white Christians in those conversations, while certainly learning from the wisdom of our brothers and sisters of color. We should not put that responsibility on our Black, Indigenous, and brothers and sisters of color. However, that is a difficult road. That is a very difficult road, which is no excuse to not do it, but it is difficult. And so I think acknowledging and learning that history and naming it is a way of exposing it finally to the light, so that we might find some way forward toward healing. But I think as long as we live in denial about the historic roots of racist ideas in the church and the development of racist ideas and racist institutions and the American church, how they developed together in the US, until we acknowledge that and name that, it's going to be really hard to make progress.
Thank you, Kyle. I am so grateful for all of our panelists that we are coming to the end of our time. And as we end, we always like to end with a call to action led by the Reverend Michael Malcom. Michael, I'd love to get your thoughts. I've been really thrilled by this conversation that has touched upon really key issues of power, the power of media institutions, the power of white supremacy, the power of age, and how that plays out in our society. And so I'd love to get your thoughts on how we are called to action in this moment.
Yeah, Brooks, I think that we're called to action to confront in this moment. It's just as Reverend Kyle has said. What my pastor here in Birmingham is Reverend Jennifer Sanders of Beloved Community Church, and she said a lot of things of great wisdom. And one of the things that she said that's really motivational is there can be no reconciliation without conciliation. So what Reverend Kyle has just spoke on, we've got to confront the truth and really have some honest conversation and acknowledging where we've been and what we've done and how we've been affected by it. And understand that media and as well as other institutions have been used to continue to perpetuate a message that causes us to be more isolated and individualized in community. And that's totally against what God intended for us. And so in getting back to who we are and who we're called to be, let's start confronting the truth and acknowledging what the truth is. And then we move from there. Other than that, it's just a cover up. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Reverend Michael Malcom, and thanks again to all of our panelists for being with us today and those who have been in our audience asking terrific questions. We are sorry we weren't able to get to all of them. Look for an email in the coming week. We'll send out a YouTube link for today's webinar along with other links referenced in the chat box. And again, thank you. And we'll also have news for our next webinar too as well. That'll be next month. So thanks again to everyone. We wish you well. Take care.